Hey everybody, welcome to the Briefing Room. I'm Devin Dwyer in Washington. Great to have you with us on this Wednesday. A lot to go over today as the White House gears up to push back against Congress. They're back next week. And of course, a lot of other headlines we're following out of the White House today. And for that, we have a whole team here joining us. Jordan Phelps, our White House reporter. Tara Palmieri, our White House correspondent, is here. A lot to get into. Let's start with this new, well, we were just saying, Tara, it's not exactly a new strategy, but it certainly is coming into focus. This approach by the White House to basically stonewall all of Congress's requests. Now, subpoena threats, they're denying them just in the past 24 hours. We're getting some overt pushback from the White House. This is something that you've seen as being a long time coming.
Well, when I spoke to his team back in December, right after the Democrats won the majority in the House, they were saying that the strategy is to stonewall. They kept recalling that Eric Holder, as Attorney General, was held in contempt of Congress. They saw that they thought that the document production from the Clintons during his impeachment hearings was very slow, and they were sort of looking to cues from the past as to how they could slow roll this entire thing. They did explicitly say to me they were going to stonewall things, and just this past weekend I spoke to the president's lawyer, Rudy Giuliani, and he said to me, we will fight every subpoena. This is not a legal battle. This is a political battle. It is with Congress. They are the Democrats. We are the Republicans, and that is it, and that is how we are going to frame it. Now, we know this is a legal battle because it can end up in the courts, but right now, they're playing this card, and there's an idea, which I read about this morning, about just running out the clock, which is what they seem to be suggesting earlier on. And it's possible that once the campaigns kick up into high gear, there may not really be the appetite for this kind of fight.
Yeah, that Fast and Furious case with Eric Holder that you're talking about from 2014, that was litigated into the courts for 3.5 years.
Exactly.
They did run out the court, and by the time the court actually ruled against the administration and said they had to turn over the documents, it was basically a moot point. They had all left office already, so they're looking to follow that same playbook. And Jordan, bring you into this. What does Congress actually want? Remind us what they're looking for and what all these subpoenas are all about.
There's a slew of things Congress is looking into, but the biggest fight right now is they want to see Don McGahn, who is the former White House counsel and was very much the star of the Mueller report. He was in there, you know, a number of times and kind of led the trail for Mueller's investigators with regard to the president. They want to see him investigate. They want to see him testifying on Capitol Hill. President Trump says he is going to fight that, and he told us today, Devin, just as Tara was saying, that he sees all of this as purely political. That he sees the Democrats just coming after him for 2020 purposes, and he does not want to give them any wins here. So
and Tara, as we hear from Democrats this week in the wake of the Mueller report, they're still digesting it. They are also clarifying their strategy, saying impeachment, for now at least, is off the table. They just want to keep investigating. They want to hear from all the players in the Mueller report on camera, in the hot seat, on TV, to keep the spotlight on what they perceive as being the president's misbehavior.
They obviously are getting a sense that the American public is not sold on this quite yet. You know, we talked to some of our reporters on the ground this weekend with the candidates who are deciding themselves, do I want to come out for or against impeachment, the 2020 candidates? And it seems from the people that we spoke to on the ground, the reporters, they said that the voters weren't pressuring them to make a decision. Not many questions about Mueller, not a lot of questions about the Russia investigation. So clearly the Democrats have figured out that they need to build the political will for impeachment. This report was not enough.
So let's get into now a little bit more deeper how subpoenas actually work. What power does Congress, do the Democrats actually have to compel testimony from somebody like Don McGahn to get the president's tax returns? Can they do this? Joining us now for a little bit more on those questions and some analysis, legal analysis, is Margaret Taylor, a fellow at the Brookings Institution, also senior editor of the Lawfare blog, and a former chief counsel to the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Margaret, thanks so much for coming in. Great to see you.
Thank you for having me.
So break it down for us. Do the Democrats have any real power here when it comes to issuing these subpoenas to the White House?
So they do. The power of Congress to investigate is very broad, and it's not specifically outlined in the Constitution, but the Supreme Court has over and over recognized the broad power of Congress to investigate, to obtain testimony and documents. And so that's really what we're talking about here. Now, a congressional subpoena is one of the tools that Congress uses to effectuate that power, that oversight and investigative power. These subpoenas are typically issued by a congressional committee, either by vote or by the chairman of the committee issuing the subpoena. And they are a real thing, and they're an embodiment of Congress's power to investigate.
How do they actually, to interrupt you there, Margaret, how do they actually enforce them? Can they actually issue fines? Can they hold, say, Don McGahn if he refuses to come in? Could Congress throw him in jail?
So technically, there's a few answers to that. There is, in theory, there's a possibility that the Congress can issue something called a contempt citation, and then the executive branch could actually bring a suit against the person. Now, practically speaking, the president and the executive branch aren't typically going to do that if they oppose the person complying with the subpoena. There is something called Congress's inherent contempt power, which basically, if you get right down to it, would mean sending out the Capitol Police to basically get someone and put them in a holding space on Capitol Hill. That hasn't been used for decades and decades and decades, and for obvious reasons isn't the way people like to go.
Because we're a little bit shocked by what you just said. So we could, in theory, see the Capitol Police go hunt down somebody like Don McGahn, and I mean, it would be quite the provocative move to say the least, but they could go get him and bring him and detain him on the Hill?
That, in theory, yes. And there was a Herbert Hoover administration official that was actually held in the Willard Hotel decades and decades ago pursuant to that authority. Now, that's really uncommon. The most common sort of way for the Congress to effectuate its subpoena power and its contempt citation is to instigate a civil enforcement action in court. The problem with this mechanism is that it can often take a very, very long time for a court to actually render a decision on those issues. But that is the normal course. Now, I want to just mention one other thing, which is that Congress can use its other constitutional powers to put pressure on the president and the executive branch to comply with subpoenas. So, for example, the Congress has the power of the purse. It could, in theory, refuse to, for example, fund something that was a high priority for the president or the administration as a way to force the compliance with the subpoena.
Yeah, I mean, Tara, that's interesting because we've seen the Congress try this before with this White House, delay confirmation hearings for certain nominees, as Margaret was saying, deny funding for certain priorities. But this president doesn't seem particularly bothered when he really feels passionately about something.
It doesn't really seem that legislation is really his priority. I know he's meeting with Nancy Pelosi next week about infrastructure, but what are they expecting to get done in the next 2 years? And if they're just having these political fights, the Democrats and the Republicans have to accept that they might not have anything to show for 2020. And that's something that they're thinking in their calculus right now. And
Margaret, so what's your bottom line here on this flurry of subpoenas that we have seen already, that we expect to see? Do you think any of these will actually have some teeth, or do you think that this process, in effect, is mostly a political show? And a lot of these Trump officials who apparently now are all going to be refusing the subpoenas will be able to run out the clock?
I think there is a substantial risk that the White House and President Trump will be able to run out the clock. However, what's unusual here is the President and the White House taking just a very definitive view of no cooperation. That's unusual in our history. And that type of really sort of a stiff-arming response across the board could have the effect of actually speeding up some of these court proceedings, because typically there's a back and forth, a good faith accommodation process that would go on. But if the White House isn't participating in that, then a judge might be more willing to go ahead and get to the merits of a case and decide it.
Really interesting stuff. Margaret Taylor at the Brookings Institution. Thank you so much, Margaret. Thanks for coming in.
Thank you so much for having me.
And some other interesting news out of the White House that you've been following, Tara, involves the president and his team sort of pushing back in another way against members of his own national security team. You're learning that Homeland Security Secretary Kirstjen Nielsen, who would just resign, she was pushed out of the White House, had tried to raise the issue of Russian meddling in our politics now. The same sorts of things we saw in the Mueller report. In the White House, the president himself was very reluctant to listen to this.
Right. Great reporting we have from Catherine Faulders shows that the president was distant. And this goes back to the issue that President Trump has had this entire time. He will not take the idea of Russian meddling, of Russian collusion seriously, because it strikes at the heart of the legitimacy of his presidency, and it suggests that he did not win this fight fair and square. And as we know, he always says he had a landslide when he won by the most, electoral points. He had the popular vote. As we know, that didn't happen. So it all comes back to the fact that the Russia collusion story, it strikes at the heart of the fact that he's a legitimate president. And even Jared Kushner, who was his de facto campaign manager and takes credit for the digital success of the campaign, he distanced himself from this Russia collusion narrative, saying that it's been more harmful to the nation than actually investigating it. It was really some shocking comments yesterday at a Time Magazine's event, but because it also strikes as his legitimacy as a campaign
really downplaying
official.
it, raising a lot of concern, too, among national security officials. Jordan, there's some pushback from the White House as well on this.
There absolutely is. There was really some interesting reporting from the New York Times that Nielsen was directly rebuffed by Acting Chief of Staff Mick Mulvaney, that he told her, do not try to bring this up with the president. Mulvaney is pushing back on that, but he's not offering a direct denial. He says in a statement, I don't recall anything along those lines happening in any meeting. So he's saying he doesn't remember. He's not saying it didn't happen explicitly. But Devin, it's worth noting that whether or not this exchange happened with Mick Mulvaney, national security officials have told ABC News that it's a known thing within this administration that if you bring up this topic of Russian interference, the potential for future Russian interference, it causes a visceral reaction with President Trump, because for him bringing up this topic brings into question the legitimacy of his own electoral
So many
victory.
national security officials trying to address this concern, legitimate concern, quietly, not drawing his attention. I imagine that's quite difficult to do when the chief executive is not on board. But thank you both for that reporting. Something to watch. Tara Palmieri, White House correspondent. Jordan Phelps will stick around as we move now to the president on the road today. He was down in Atlanta for a summit on opioid abuse and opioid addiction. He traveled there with the First Lady a short time ago, addressing what he called successes the administration has been having in the opioid epidemic. Take a listen.
My administration is deploying every resource at our disposal to empower you, to support you, and to fight right by your side. And that's what we're doing. We have results that are unbelievable. Numbers that I heard 2 weeks ago that I was shocked to hear. We're making tremendous progress.
All right, so here are some of those numbers. Take a look. These are from the White House, citing some of their successes in the opioid crisis over the past couple of years. The president says he's put forward $6 billion in new funding. They are touting a 5% decline in overdose deaths nationwide. He talked a lot today about a 34% decline in opioid prescriptions, doctors writing those prescriptions. And he even says that the Trump administration is tracking 68% fewer adults over 26 using heroin. Those are significant numbers, especially in some of the hard-hit areas. Take a look at this number out of West Virginia. The president today singling out that state, which, according to the NIH, is the epicenter of the opioid epidemic. He says overdose deaths there are down 20% over the last year. So looks like we've maybe turned a corner.
Yeah, significant numbers.
numbers.
This is something that President Trump has been talking about since the campaign. But Devin, it's worth noting that even if we have seen a recent trend in downward spiral, this has been ticking upwards exponentially since 1999. So it was about time we cracked it
Right,
out.
maybe a little bit of a dip, but what are people seeing on the ground? Is this being felt in those hard-hit communities like West Virginia? Let's go there now to meet Caitlin Sussman. She's a social worker at a recovery house in Morgantown, West Virginia, someone who some of our ABC News viewers may be familiar with. She's spoken with us before. Caitlin, it's great to see you. So I want to get your reaction to sort of the numbers the White House was celebrating today. Do you feel like we've turned a corner in this crisis, and do you feel that 20% decline in overdose deaths?
Well, two things. Certainly, we've turned a corner related to states resources to medical assistance, harm reduction, and trying to develop recovery services. So that turned a corner there.
So we're having some trouble with the connection, obviously, with Caitlin Sussman. Caitlin, we'll have to try you back in a bit if we can get the signal back. But we have heard, Jordan, from a lot of these community members on the ground, from our team that's been reporting out in West Virginia, including here in the briefing room, that they're continuing to see this problem. It's not going away. As you were alluding to, the spike was so significant over the past 10 years that even a 20% dip in deaths doesn't mean that the addiction rates are waning in a significant way.
Yeah, absolutely. And the Obama administration came under a lot of criticism for maybe missing this problem as being such a big thing for so long. But, you know, as we've seen with these new numbers the White House has put out, they have been putting an eye towards this program. They've been putting a lot of investment toward it. We know Kellyanne Conway, the First Lady, have been putting a real focus here.
Something we will keep an eye on here in the briefing room. Again, taking a look here at some of the successes the White House is touting today, though, as we said before we caught up with Caitlin there, West Virginia still has the highest rate of drug overdose deaths in the nation, 3 times the national average. 800 people died last year alone in that state, so our thoughts are with those families today. Moving on now to politics, 2020 politics. The race for president on the Democratic side is about to get a little bit more crowded. We've been anticipating for some time former Vice President Joe Biden jumping into the race, and our Biden expert here at ABC News, our off-air reporter Molly Nagel, is here to tell us a little bit about what's in store for Joe Biden. Let's just show the field for everybody that he is going to be running against, because it is significant. He's one of the last to get in. Well, this is the poll. There's the field.
There we go.
A whole bunch of folks that he's going to be up against. We expect this announcement tomorrow, Molly. He does get in, first graphic we saw there, atop the list, so he's got something going in his favor.
That's right. It's been the announcement everybody has kind of long rumored and waiting for. Joe Biden officially entering the race tomorrow morning, releasing a video online announcing his candidacy. Now, he'll follow that up with an event on Monday in Pittsburgh, ABC News has learned. But he does enter this race as the 20th Democratic candidate entering the race, but also atop of the polls, as you referenced. The challenge for him will be staying on top of the polls as the front runner.
Yeah, and let's talk about some of the advantages, the strengths he brings to the race, because he does have a lot of them as he gets in. Let's help us talk through some of these, Molly. You and I were going through his credentials earlier, and Biden has a lot of firepower, starting with his experience.
That's right. Joe Biden has nearly 100% name recognition. He's a former vice president. He's served 37 years in the Senate. So he has a long list of experience. And a lot of people, when you ask them what they like about Joe Biden at these events, they name his experience as a top part of that. They know that he's somebody who can walk into the Oval Office on day one and get the job done.
He spent more time in the White House than any of the other 2020 Democratic contenders. He also has been able, even though he's not in the race, suck up a lot of expert staff and campaign aides, advisors. They've stuck with him this whole way. So he's got some pros advising him as well.
Definitely. One thing about Biden world is that they are notoriously loyal. He keeps a very small group of loyal advisors at his side. A lot of the same people that you're going to hear talked about in 2020 were a lot of the same people who were advising him in 2016 on that possible run when he was still considering that. So he keeps a very close staff.
And of course, his ties to President Obama, who's still very popular, will help him, no doubt.
Of course. And, Joe Biden has already been touting this. President Obama has said he's not going to endorse in the primary, but Joe Biden already says that he's an Obama-Biden Democrat, and he's going to definitely run on his connection to the former president.
And Jordan, you've been out to his hometown and covered his roots. That's a big part of his strengths that he brings to this race and that his team is talking about is his blue-collar appeal. A lot of unions already getting behind Joe Biden.
Absolutely. That is one of his strengths. But, Devin, we also know there are a lot of weaknesses for Biden.
Let's take a look at what some of those are here. We got a graphic.
Absolutely. Even before he got out, fundraising, that's always been one weakness of Biden's. He hasn't really liked doing that part of the job.
And in fact, today, Molly, on the front page of the New York Times, they said he starts with $0. $0.
Yeah, when you look at his
behind big time.
When you look at his FEC report from the Biden for America campaign in 2012, as of June of 2012, that sits at $0. Zero cash on hand.
And Bernie Sanders, on the other hand, has over $26 million raised already.
Right. Biden is going to face a lot of comparisons, especially in these first few days that he's in the race, to see how his fundraising stacks up to some of these other candidates like Beto O'Rourke and Bernie Sanders, who brought in some pretty amazing sums in their first 24 hours, not to mention how much they have in the campaign as a whole.
And guys, we were talking previously about his experience being both a strength, but also being a bit of a weakness here, not only with some of the baggage of being, you know, in the Senate for so long, all those votes that his opponents will be able to pour over and use against him, but we were talking about these female accusers, if you will, who have come out recently and talked about how uncomfortable Joe Biden has made them feel.
Absolutely. Joe Biden is from a different generation, right? And he put out that video after all of these accusations came out, and he said, look, he gets it. He's willing to change. But the problem for, you know, this party is if they're looking for something fresh, for something new, Joe Biden is not that guy. He's been around the block many times.
And he has struggled to clean up for some of those missteps, as he's put them. And we had an interview here in the briefing room just a couple of weeks ago with one of the women who said they felt uncomfortable by Joe Biden, Sophie Karasik. Here's what she said about the vice president and how he's tried to make amends. Take a listen.
What matters is the impact that his actions and words are having. Of course, his intentions matter too, but it's not that the impact doesn't matter at all. And I think that contrary to the clip that was released the other day joking about this shows that actually he doesn't get it.
And is his team, are they concerned about this, or do they think they have a good handle on messaging around that front going forward?
Look, I think they have to be concerned about it because it's a storyline that continues to kind of bubble. But the real challenge that the Biden camp is going to face is how to balance this recognition that this type of behavior is not okay with the Joe Biden that a lot of people really love and connect with. That's going to be a huge challenge for him while he's out on the campaign trail. How to be his true, authentic self while not crossing these lines and not making anybody feel uncomfortable, and being very cognizant that he's going to be under a microscope when it comes to this type of behavior because of this.
And standing out, Jordan, at a time when the Democratic Party is changing its face. There's a field of diverse Democratic candidates, a lot of women in the race, a lot of minority candidates in the race. A lot of conversation about whether Joe Biden's moment has passed. That will be a challenge for him.
Yeah, absolutely. And if he were to actually win the election, he'd be, I think, the oldest person ever to hold the office.
He'd be 78 on Inauguration Day if he were to win the presidency.
I mean, that's just remarkable. So certainly he's not the new face, but a lot of people, a lot of establishment people are turning to him as maybe the safest bet to take on President
All right, a lot to
Trump.
watch. Molly Nagel, thanks so much. You'll be out on the road with Joe Biden as this announcement lands tomorrow and then into the weekend. So we look forward to catching up with you. Thanks for coming in the briefing room.
Thank you.
Finally today, we're going to shine the spotlight here in the briefing room on a story that hasn't gotten a lot of attention. This one out of the UN up in New York. The United Nations Security Council earlier this week debated a resolution aimed at combating sexual violence in war. This was a resolution at the Security Council that would have condemned rape as a weapon of war and expressed support and justice for victims. Two people leading the charge on this one were Angelina Jolie and Amal Clooney. Here's what she had to say about promoting this resolution.
The crimes committed by ISIS against women and girls are unlike anything we have witnessed in modern times. ISIS controlled territory the size of the United Kingdom and ruled over 8 million people. More than 40,000 foreign fighters from 110 countries are estimated to have joined ISIS's ranks in Iraq and Syria. But the question of bringing them to justice has barely raised a whisper. The resolution you are considering today notes the prevalence of sexual violence in wars all over the world and states that you are, quote, deeply concerned over the slow progress in eliminating sexual violence in conflict. I agree that we are facing an epidemic of sexual violence, and I believe that justice is the antidote.
And that epidemic getting a lot of attention at the UN. That resolution did pass 13-0, but not without some controversy. Let's get into what that controversy was and what it meant for the text of the resolution with Sheba Crocker, the Vice President of CARE, which is an international humanitarian organization, also a former State Department official. Sheba, thank you so much for joining us in the briefing room. I suppose on one hand, it's some good news that we saw the UN endorse this resolution, but on the other hand, I understand from a lot of groups, including yours, that this was a bit disappointing. Explain why.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, this isn't the first time we've seen a UN Security Council resolution on this issue. And the disappointing part was that with the passage yesterday and the text in this year's resolution, we've seen a walk back from a critical part of the resolution, which is the kind of support that survivors need. Survivors and victims of sexual violence and conflict. So although the resolution did, as you say, and as Amal Clooney was talking about, address aspects around justice and accountability for these crimes, the big missing piece and the part that was really watered down and in effect taken out of this resolution altogether was an unwavering commitment by the international community to ensure that women and girls who have faced this kind of horrific violence, in many cases sexual violence in the context of war, have access to the full panoply of critical health services, reproductive and sexual related health services that they need, and that CARE sees every day in the work that we do around the world that the survivors of this kind of violence need.
And among those services, I imagine, are contraceptive needs and potentially abortion. Is that what was outraging the Trump administration on that front?
Well, I mean, I think the question we have to ask the U.S. administration and the U.S. mission to the United Nations is what message do they want to send to women and girls who have suffered from this kind of horrific violence? There's no room for politics or political maneuvering here. The real question is, are we going to offer these women and girls, the survivors of this kind of violence, the right kind of services and the services that we know they need, and not only that they need, but that they actually have a fundamental human right
Yeah, we heard from a lot of the other delegates at the UN, the French among them, Sheba, outraged because of the reasons you're citing there. But for our viewers who aren't familiar with the scope and extent of sexual violence in war, many people call it rape in war. How bad is it? I mean, can you give us a sense of what we're talking about when you talk about sexual violence in war?
Yeah, I mean, it can take a range of forms, obviously, and sort of massive gang rape and just rape of women is one of the most extreme, but it also involves human trafficking. It can involve intimate partner violence. So there are a range of things that women face. I mean, I think if you want to know about the extent of it, what we've seen is that about 1 in 5 women who are in a humanitarian emergency report that they have faced some kind of sexual violence. So, of course, again, the type of violence might range, but that's an enormous number if you think about it, right? 20% of women and women and girls always are the most vulnerable in the context of emergencies, always have the most difficult time even accessing basic services like water and food. And then you layer on top of that 1 in 5 of them are reported to be experiencing some kind of sexual violence. And it's that piece really that is so disappointing and represents such a huge walk back yesterday in the text of the resolution that was passed.
And aside, real quickly, before we let you go, Sheba, aside from awareness, which this resolution helps raise, obviously having this conversation is important, but what more can be done concretely to help solve this problem?
Well, again, I mean, having the full panoply of sort of the UN agencies being able to come in and help survivors of violence with the full range of protection and support that they are entitled to is a critical piece of that. And that's why the fact that the UN Security Council yesterday basically said, directly or indirectly, right, that women do not have the right and will not have access necessarily to all the kinds of support that they need. So CARE and other groups like us certainly will remain alongside these women and helping to support them, regardless of what the UN Security Council may have said yesterday. But in effect, the UN Security Council was talking about both what the UN agencies and the UN system needs to do and the rights and responsibilities of member states in these situations. And so for them to have fallen silent on this question is just a really tremendous disappointment.
You know, troubling to a lot of people, a lot of American allies as well. Sheba Kropker with CARE organization, former State Department official. Thanks for joining us today. Thanks for helping to raise awareness about this very important issue, sexual violence in war at the UN. Our thanks to Sheba. Jordan, a lot to cover today in the briefing room, a lot tomorrow. We know that this is a big weekend for White House correspondents as well. We'll be keeping an eye on the White House Correspondents Association dinner on Saturday night. The president's not going this year.
No, and he didn't go last year. And, you know, so this isn't entirely surprising, but what is new this year is we're also not going to see other White House officials there. There's a total ban, if you'll call it, on them going there. The White House doesn't want to call it a ban. We got kind of late notice that a lot of these people that we had invited to the dinner won't be showing up, but we're still going to be there to celebrate the journalism we do every day and have a good time.
And the First Amendment, for sure. The president headed to Green Bay, Wisconsin this weekend. We'll have that coverage for you here on ABC News Live, but a lot more news ahead here on ABC News Live. Hope you'll stay tuned for that. Otherwise, great to have Jordan Phelps with us here in the briefing room. I'm Devin Dwyer in Washington. Hope to see you back here tomorrow, 3:30 Eastern. See you then.